Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. 2021 is almost over. And today we look at the biggest China news that happened this year. First up, the virus outbreaks. To prevent large-scale virus outbreaks from spreading across the country, the Chinese regime has taken a so-called zero-tolerance control philosophy. It has not stopped outbreaks from sporadically springing up once in a while, but it has caused pushbacks among Chinese citizens. Although such pushbacks often disappear from the public eye very quickly due to the regime's strong censorship. Under the zero-tolerance policy, Chinese healthcare workers have euthanized 3 cats. That's because their owner was infected with the virus. Health workers also broke into a dog owner's home and beat her corgi to death. That's because the owner was suspected of being infected. Other than killing pets, the Chinese regime has also taken the path of strict lockdowns and mass testing. In October, a high-speed train heading for Beijing was halted midway after an attendant was identified as a close contact of someone who tested positive. Over 200 passengers on board were immediately quarantined. And in a county in Jiangxi province, local authorities turned all traffic lights red to prevent people from moving around. In Inner Mongolia, officials banned over 10,000 travelers from going home after announcing a sudden lockdown. Over 4,000 of those trapped in the area are seniors over 60 years old. In northern China's Dalian City and Lanzhou City, authorities sealed off residents' doors with an alarm system. Once the doors are open, the alarm will go off. And more advanced technology is used to control the Chinese people. Sichuan province in southwestern China implemented a system with an interesting name, time-space overlap. The system targets people who have spent at least 10 minutes with a confirmed patient, with an area equal to about 6 blocks in New York City. These people will get extra tests and go into quarantine. The system also shows how much data the regime has over its residents, their specific locations at a certain time. And in western China's Xinjiang region, one netizen left a comment on Chinese social media Weibo that it's not the outbreak that's driving us crazy, but instead the Xinjiang government's control. But Chinese people have largely ignored the side effects caused by these measures, and the CCP may have gotten what it wants through such measures, claiming itself the savior of the Chinese people. Communist leader Xi Jinping declared at a ceremony in September that the great practice of fighting the epidemic has once again proved that the incomparably strong leadership of the Communist Party of China is the most reliable backbone of the Chinese people in times of storm. Next up, Chinese Communist leader Xi Jinping is trying to take China in a new direction, which would have a major impact on the international community. A China affairs analyst speaks with NTD.
Communist leader Xi Jinping wants to steer the future of China. In doing so, he's presenting a new interpretation of the past. Ahead of next year's National Congress, the Communist Party approved a summary of its 100-year history earlier this month, called the Historical Resolution. It's a big deal, as this marks only the 3rd time ever the party has released such a document. And each time it happened in the past, the party changed its direction. This time, China affairs analyst Tong Jingyuan says the new direction is aimed at gaining global supremacy.
It's very likely that in the future, the direction of Xi Jinping's policies will shift to a state that's more and more adversarial toward the international community.
The first 2 historical resolutions were passed back in the 40s and 80s by then leaders Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, respectively. In the second version, Deng criticized Mao's Cultural Revolution and started to reform China from a centrally planned economy to a market system. But compared to those earlier editions, Xi Jinping's version uses a very different rhetoric.
In the second historical resolution, we can see that there's a large section that condemns Mao's personality cult and dictatorial actions. In this third historical resolution, that all disappeared.
Xi's version makes overwhelmingly more mention of himself than his predecessors, most of it praise. That may coincide with the 2018 removal of China's two-term limit for the head of the Communist Party. This could effectively allow him to stay in power indefinitely. There's another obvious omission. In a section glorifying and summarizing the CCP's rule over the country, another of Deng's famous phrases for China's economic reform, sticking to reform and openness, is nowhere to be seen.
Xi Jinping has in fact rejected the economic construction-centered direction through this third historical resolution. He's likely to turn a policy direction based on political struggle, as Mao did.
Tong says Xi could believe that it's his historic responsibility to establish a new world order for China. His ambition is displayed in multiple efforts. China's Belt and Road Infrastructure Plan, increased emphasis on digital currency, and the internationalization of Chinese currency, the yuan. But Tong adds, Xi's ambitions are also being met with major pushback, both inside and outside the country.
We can see that Xi Jinping is now facing an unprecedented isolated international environment. This is closely related to the political direction he's pursuing. He must have resistance inside the party. But so far, there isn't any strong evidence to prove it could block him from pursuing that route.
Tong says it's hard to see what's really going on within the party because of the lack of transparency. But he says overall, the conclusion of this third ever historical resolution is simple: that the Communist Party is ready to turn the page on a new chapter, but it might be a less peaceful one under Xi.
Although not as intense as 2020, 2021 is still a bustling year for U.S.-China relations.
Here we go.
On the U.S. side, the Biden administration's China policy is a mix of tough and soft measures. It has blacklisted dozens of major Chinese companies, including telecom giants, over national security risks. It sanctioned dozens of Chinese and Hong Kong officials over their role in suppressing Hong Kong's freedoms and persecuting Uyghurs in Xinjiang. It also banned imports of solar panel materials from Xinjiang.
DHS is deeply concerned by credible and growing reports of China's state-sponsored use of forced labor and other human rights violations in the Xinjiang region.
Expanded a Trump-era ban on American investment into certain Chinese firms, and signed bills by Congress to counter the Chinese regime. But the administration also dropped Trump's attempt to ban TikTok and WeChat. Reportedly approved licenses for Huawei to buy auto chips and allowed Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou to return to China. What's more, under Biden, the U.S. issued a joint declaration with the Chinese regime on climate change.
Now, the two largest economies in the world have agreed to work together to raise climate ambition in this decisive decade.
Eased visa restrictions on Chinese state media reporters, and returned 7 Chinese nationals in an apparent prisoner swap. The Biden administration also announced that the U.S. will not seek to change China's political system, but instead seek coexistence. While on the Chinese side, the regime has tested hypersonic weapons, among other military aggressions.
We watch closely China's development of armament and advanced capabilities and systems that will only increase tensions in the region.
They lobbied U.S. businesses to prevent China-related bills from getting passed in Congress. They sanctioned senior Trump administration officials, including former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, as well as other U.S. citizens and organizations. They passed laws to counter U.S. and EU sanctions, allowed several U.S. citizens they held for years to return to America, and held talks with U.S. officials. The regime also welcomed Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman to China, and they promised they will allow more American reporters into the country. One more thing on what looked like a prisoner swap between the U.S. and China. Some experts have criticized the move, saying that the U.S. may set a risky precedent. They point to the Chinese regime's history of arbitrarily detaining foreign citizens and sometimes using them as a political leverage. And the Chinese company that occupied the most headlines in 2021 is probably Evergrande. Chinese real estate giant Evergrande is going through a slow motion collapse, and its decline is revealing some truths about the Chinese economy. It all started in 2008. The Chinese regime that year launched a 4 trillion yuan economic stimulus package in response to the global financial crisis. Against the backdrop of loose credit policies, the real estate industry expanded rapidly and became one of the pillar industries that fueled China's economic development. The sector accounts for about a quarter of China's GDP and is a major force driving economic growth. The Communist Party sees economic growth as a way to legitimize its rule. The process drove up GDP numbers as well as housing prices, which reached heights of up to 40 times average income levels. Other side effects came later. For example, there are now 130 million vacant houses. A batch of local governments are sinking into debt and relying heavily on selling land use rights to make money. There's $5 trillion worth of debt in the real estate sector, and the Chinese economy doesn't have an easy substitute for the housing market to drive economic growth. Now that the Chinese regime is trying to rein in debt, the growth model known as borrow and build may come to a close. A renowned Chinese economist estimated in November that if the regime doesn't change its policy direction in another 3 to 6 months, more than 60% of Chinese private real estate firms may face abnormal cash flow or even debt defaults. This October, China saw its biggest decline in housing prices in 6 years. And Chinese media reported that in September, housing prices in 70 large and medium-sized cities fell for the first time since 2015. Sales of new homes fell in 36 cities, while sales of second-hand homes fell in 52 cities. It remains to be seen whether the regime will be able to find a substitute to drive its economy, and fast. As the world's second-largest economy and second-largest importer, a slowing Chinese economy is sure to spill some of those negative impacts beyond its borders. Real estate isn't the only sector China is leaning on. Another major pillar of the economy is the export market. But with labor costs now on the rise, it may get harder for China to keep its status as the world's factory. For the past few decades, some of the people in China have been willing to ignore issues like unfair social welfare policies and human rights abuses because there's money to make. But with China's economy at risk, this raises the question: will the Communist Party's ideological control be strong enough to convince the Chinese people to keep ignoring these widespread issues? "2021 was a bad year for Chinese tech and education companies. Starting late 2020, the Chinese regime kicked off an unprecedented onslaught against big tech in China. At its most extreme, the crackdown caused a sell-off that erased $1.5 trillion from Chinese stocks.
Some of China's biggest names have been in deepest trouble. The Chinese regime kicked off the campaign against them in November of 2020 by firing the first shot at Chinese billionaire Jack Ma's fintech darling Ant Group. Beijing called off the company's New York IPO and suspended what could become the world's biggest stock market debut.
But everyone was absolutely stunned when all of a sudden we were waiting for it and they just decided not to do it.
Then the CCP unveiled its new antitrust rules, officially starting the crackdown. Jack Ma's Alibaba was investigated and received a record fine for alleged market dominance. Ma himself disappeared for a while. Fintech branches of other tech firms, including Tencent and Meituan, were also targeted. This summer, the regime suspended a second promising IPO, that of China's largest ride-hailing company, Didi. Authorities then removed 25 Didi-related apps from app stores in China. They also accused the company of violating data security laws. Didi's third biggest shareholder, Uber, said in November that it suffered a $2.4 billion loss in a quarter because of its investments in Didi. The regime then turned its fire to China's 700,000 private after-school tutoring companies.
U.S. shares of Toll Education and New Oriental Education each dropped more than 50%. Both provide tutoring and test prep services in China. It's just after news the Chinese regime is barring tutoring for profit in core school subjects.
The regime banned such companies from making profits, raising capital, or going public. That has caused massive downsizing, and the 10 million teachers in this sector face the danger of losing their jobs at any time. Japanese outlet Nikkei Asia cited analysts estimating that a third of such jobs, or 3 million people, could be unemployed due to the crackdown. Other sectors targeted include the entertainment industry, the gaming industry, and food delivery tech companies. So for China's private sector giants, gone are the days of largely unrestrained growth, and we will likely see more of the consequences for the Chinese economy and the global economy next year. The CCP claims the goal of the crackdown is antitrust and to prevent monopoly, but it doesn't explain why such onslaught disproportionately targets private firms, while state-owned giants in the banking, telecom, and energy sectors continue to dominate the market. Some experts argue that in the future, the role of private enterprises may become even weaker in the Chinese economy, whereas state-owned firms might gradually regain the type of authority they once enjoyed before the country's economic reform.
Severe floods swept through Henan and other Chinese provinces in 2021. Record rainfall combined with bad policies took the lives of over 300 local residents. That's according to official data. The actual death toll is suspected to be higher. Despite warnings of heavy rainfall, local authorities did not close businesses or the subway system, as experts say they should have. That led to 14 people drowning in a subway tunnel. Officials discharged water from a nearby reservoir without alerting downstream residents. During the flood, they also sealed off the exit of a highway, where hundreds of vehicles were trapped inside a tunnel within minutes. 6 people there were confirmed dead. To prevent negative coverage of the flood, Chinese state-affiliated organizations and media outlets also reportedly encourage residents to harass foreign journalists. Some foreign correspondents in China say they were surrounded by local residents on site while trying to interview people. Some even received death threats. 2021 was an eventful year for the power game among the U.S., China, and Taiwan. Beijing has never made an invasion of Taiwan look this real, and Taiwan has never enjoyed this much international support since the 1970s, when countries broke their ties with Taiwan to recognize Communist China. Let's take a look.
The year started with a bombshell move from the U.S. In January, then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo lifted all restrictions on official exchanges between the U.S. and Taiwan. Taiwan welcomed the move, saying this removed decades-long discriminations. In the past, Taiwanese officials could only meet their U.S. counterparts in hotels, instead of being allowed to enter the State Department. On the other side, the Chinese regime hardened its tone, warning that Taiwan independence means war. The Taiwanese people were surprised to see how deep the CCP's hands have reached into their society. In February, 4 former Taiwanese military officers were charged for spying for the Chinese regime. The investigation later reached the man who used to be number 3 in Taiwan's defense ministry. In March, the Chinese regime weaponized trade to punish Taiwan, banning imports of pineapples from the island. But the economic coercion faced backlash from the world. Other democracies started the Free Pineapple movement and bought more Taiwanese pineapples to support Taiwan. That same month, the top U.S. admiral warned U.S. lawmakers that China could invade Taiwan as soon as in the next 6 years.
I worry that they're accelerating their ambitions to supplant the United States and our leadership role in the rules-based international order, which they've long said that they want to do that by 2050. Taiwan is clearly one of their ambitions before then, and I think the threat is manifest during this decade, in fact, in the next 6 years.
The Taiwanese Air Force announced that it will increase budget to deal with Chinese warplanes' frequent invasion into Taiwan's air defense zone. In April, Taiwanese authorities announced the weight of mainland China as a designation for Taiwanese investment has dropped significantly, from 84% in 2010 to 33% in 2020. In mid-April, President Biden sent unofficial delegations to Taiwan to meet with Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen. The White House called it a personal signal of the president's commitment to the island's democracy. In July, the CCP celebrated the 100th anniversary of its founding. Communist leader Xi Jinping declared that resolving the Taiwan issue and achieve complete reunification is the Chinese Communist Party's historical mission, meaning it's something the party will never give up. And in August, a poll in Taiwan showed that about 90% of Taiwan's residents identify themselves as Taiwanese, while less than 5% consider themselves Chinese in terms of nationality. About 65% say they're willing to go to war to defend the island. In September, renowned international credit ratings company Fitch Ratings and Moody's started to address Taiwan as Taiwan China. Taiwanese officials requested the agencies to correct what they call inappropriate terms. In October, Harvard University announced that it will move a popular Chinese language program from Beijing to Taipei. The program's director says that's because there is a lack of friendliness from the Chinese host institution. Also in October, Europe took major steps to beef up relations with Taiwan. The European Parliament passed a blueprint which includes more bilateral investments and supports Taiwan's role in international organizations. That's not long before a group of European officials arrived in Taiwan to meet with President Tsai Ing-wen, ignoring Beijing's anger. Later that month, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken formally supported Taiwan joining the United Nations. Also in October, a CCP-affiliated Chinese expert said in an interview that after China takes over Taiwan, it should carry out an ethnic cleansing of any Taiwanese with Japanese heritage. Taiwan was under Japanese rule for half a century before the nationalist Chinese government took control in 1945. CCP mouthpiece, the Global Times, also called for a final solution to the Taiwan question. The language is reminiscent of the Nazis' final solution to the Jewish question and caused criticisms from German politicians. And in November, a U.S. think tank report showed that the Chinese regime has used artificial intelligence to simulate a war game for the invasion of Taiwan. Meanwhile, American top General Mark Milley said that he doesn't believe the invasion could happen in the next 2 years, but he assured that the U.S. has full capability to protect the island. Later that month, Secretary Blinken vowed that allied nations will take action if China uses force against Taiwan. And also in November, the Chinese regime blacklisted several Taiwanese officials for taking a harder line against the CCP. Beijing also punished some Taiwanese companies doing business in mainland China for being associated with the officials.
And that's all for our China in Focus Top China News of the Year Roundup. And before you go, we have a short announcement. I will be off next week, but my lovely colleague Evelyn Lee will be filling in. And I will see you all in the new year.